In the last video, we learned how to use the wrec library to build a counter web component. In this video, we'll build a few more components using the wrec library. We'll start by building a number slider. The number slider looks like what you see on the left. There's a label in front of the slider, and then it's using an input with a type of range to display that slider, and then to the right we display the current value of it. And so I can grab the thumb on the slider and move that. And we've got two of them here. So let's take a look at the code that implements this. So just like before, we're importing the wrec class, and then we're creating a class that extends from wrec. I have a static property that is a list of all of the properties for this component, and it has 5 of them. The label is what is displayed in front of the slider. Then there's a label width, and that's important because if I have more than one, I might want all of those labels to have the same width and have them be right aligned, and that's what you see over on the right. Each slider can have a minimum and a maximum value, and those default to 0 and 100. And then I can specify the starting value, and if I don't give a starting value, it starts at 0. My CSS styles the component as a whole using the :host selector. So you can think of that like being a div that surrounds everything in the component. And I want to use a flex layout. I want align items to be center so that they're vertically centered. And then I want a gap between each of the items of a half of a rem. And so the items I have are the 3 that you see over on the right: the label, the slider itself, and then the current value. The slider itself has a width of 6 rem, and that's probably something that I should make configurable, but for now we'll leave that hard-coded. The label has a specific width, and here's our first example where we see dynamic styling. So I wish that I could allow an arbitrary Java expression to be the value of a CSS property. Unfortunately, that doesn't work because the CSS parser in the web browser sees that as an invalid value and it just strips it out. But what we can do is use a JavaScript expression as the value of a CSS variable. And so that's what I'm doing on line 24, where I set the label width variable to whatever the value of the property label width is. And then I can reference that CSS variable in other properties like you see on line 27. Going down to the HTML, it's pretty straightforward. There's a label that displays whatever the value of the this.label property is. Then there's the input with a type of range, and it uses whatever minimum I specified, defaulting to 0, and whatever maximum I specified, defaulting to 100. The value is going to be whatever the this.value property is, but I do have this extra bit of syntax, the :input. By default, all of the inputs that are processed by the wrec library listen for change events. But in this case, I want to listen for input events so that I get notified as the slider is moved and not just when focus moves away from the input. Then the span at the end is just displaying the current value. And finally, I register that web component, which is going to register a custom element with the name number-slider, all lowercase. So there's our number slider component. Let's see how we make use of that in an HTML file. So the file number-slider.html is right here. And this is what is rendering what you see over on the right. So I'm including the number slider.js file that we just looked at. I'm setting my default font family to sans serif, which ends up being inherited by the web components down below if I don't specify another font family. And so that is styling my web components. And then I have my 2 sliders, the difficulty level and the player score, both with a label width of 8 rem. The difficulty has a minimum value of 1 and a maximum of 10, starting at 1. And the score starts with a value of 0, and I'm accepting the default min and max values, which are 0 through 100. So over on the right, I can drag the sliders, and you can see that the minimum it accepts is 1 and the maximum is 10. And then for the score, I can go down to 0, and I can go all the way up to 100. Now let's see how we can use number slider in a more interesting example. We want to implement the color picker that you see here. And notice the text at the bottom, this is a test. And when I move these color sliders, the color of that text changes. And if I move the size slider, the size of the text changes. So how do we implement that? Let's take a look at the implementation of our color picker component, which of course is going to use 3 of the number sliders. So starting at the top, we're creating a class that extends from the wrec class, and then I specify all of my properties. So there's a label width that defaults to 3 rem. Well, that's a good width for my red, green, and blue labels. Then I have the value of red, which right now is set at 0, and green, which is 143 right now, and blue is the same. And then finally, we have color, which is a computed property. And so the value I give to the computed property here is just a JavaScript expression. In this case, it is a template literal string that is going to create the CSS value RGB and a paren, and then I need to insert into that the current values of red, green, and blue. And wrec is going to see these references to properties, and it's going to make this reactive. So if those change, any of those 3 values change, it's going to compute a new value for color. And going down to the CSS, I have a sliders ID, which is what is going to encompass all 3 of these sliders. And I want those to be laid out vertically. So it's flex layout with a column direction. And then the space between them will be the same. And as it turns out, this div is going to have the same height as the swatch over on the left. And then I'm evenly spacing all of those sliders vertically. The swatch itself is going to have a background color, which is the value of the CSS variable -- color. And that is going to get its value from the property this.color, which, as we saw before, is our computed property. And that's why when I change these sliders, the color in the swatch changes automatically. Going down to the HTML, we have our swatch, which is just an empty div, which gets the styling that we just looked at and has a height and a width of 5 rem, making it a square. Then we have the div that holds all of the sliders. This prettier ignore comment is just here so that prettier doesn't format the code and place the syntax for these sliders on the same line. Notice that this HTML is making calls out to the method makeSlider 3 times because I don't want to repeat this code that creates a number slider for me. They would all be pretty similar. So I just pass in the label that I want, and each one gets that label. They all have the same label width, which is whatever the value of the label width property is. They all have a maximum value of 255. The minimum for them will be the default, which is 0. And finally, the value of those is a reference to the property whose name is the lowercase version of the label. At the very bottom, we register the component. And so that's all there is to this. The amazing thing about this component is, again, how little code I had to write, and especially this styling of the swatch, how I could make a reference to a computed property, and that's just automatically picking up the values of red, green, and blue, which are themselves properties, and those end up being affected by the number slider. So when a slider value is changed, it is updating either the red, the green, or the blue property. So how do we make use of the color picker component? Going over to color demo.js, this is another web component that is implemented by inheriting from the wrec class. It has 2 properties, the current color and then a size, which starts out at 18. I'm going to use that for the size of the text that I display at the bottom. And then going down to its CSS, I'm picking up the value of the color property, which I'm going to get from the color picker component. We see that down on line 25. And I put that into the CSS variable -- color, and that ends up being used in the styling for the paragraph tag right here. I have another slider, which is for adjusting the size of the text, and I give that a minimum size of 12 pixels and a maximum size of 48. Give it a label of size, and then when this number slider value changes, I want to update the property this.size. That is tied to this CSS variable -- size, and it's used right here. And it's interesting the way that I have to specify that the units are pixels using a calc where I multiply size, which is just a number, by 1 pixel, and that's how I can get it to know that the units are pixels. Finally, at the bottom, I register the color demo component, which gives me a custom element whose name is color-demo, all lowercase. Finally, looking at the HTML file for this, all I need to do is have script tags for each of the definitions of custom elements that I'm using, and then at the bottom say I want to have a color demo. And that's all there is to it, and all of these sliders work and dynamically update the CSS as needed. So I think this is a pretty cool demo of the features of wrec. Think about how you would implement this using some other framework and even another web component library like lit. It would certainly be way more code to implement in other frameworks and a bit more code to implement this using lit.